also the people who are not registered completely in the course, I will make it available through Antonio, but I need to email all the people that are not the fan from the University of Turin. And it has, by points, the arguments of last. How many sessions did we have so far? The third session, right? Not the second.
Four. We have done three. This is the fourth. I think.
No, we've done two. This is the third. Yeah. So now what I would like to do is today, if I can, I would like to finish with Marx, so that as of tomorrow we start neoclassical economics. So the objective always is that by the end of this course you should be able to essentially understand the underpinning of economic discourses. That's what it is. You are not going to be economists, most of you are going to be lawyers and all that sort of stuff, or other disciplines, but you have, I hope that you'll be able to decipher economic blah blah. Right? That's what economics is about. Okay? So, because you get economics from all sides, you get economics everywhere. This is the example that I give to students that assume that everyone is convinced through materialistic theories, such as there's a guy in Oxford who is a scientist, Richard Dawkins. Have you heard of him? Richard Dawkins? Yeah? And Richard Dawkins is a guy who actually he strongly argues against the existence of God. Okay? Yeah. And in fact, he was a very kind of funny program. The program was not funny, it was a funny setting at the BBC, in which he was asked to debate the Archbishop of Canterbury. And yes, and then he says, why do we have to listen, he said, to this man simply because he has a special relationship with somebody who we never see? Right? That's what Dawkins said. Dawkins is a scientist. So assume that everybody gets convinced in the world that the materialistic conception of the world, the materialistic in the physical sense of Dawkins, right, gets convinced. Religion will disappear because it's substituted, it's replaced by rationality, which is a view that the great English philosopher Hume wanted. Right? Hume was the guy who developed everything had to be explained rationally in Hume. And assume now that everybody gets convinced that economic theories, that economic theorizing, the economic theories are bunk, completely zero, they make no sense. Okay? Lo and behold, after a while, economics will come back. Why? Because you'll see inflation, unemployment, some kind of business cycle, businesses are closing, some kind of financial crisis. So people will start asking again economic questions. So it will come back. So you can never get rid of economics. Never. You see, so it's really important that you know, because this will determines the discourse in lawmaking, determines the discourse in just about every aspect of our existence. And Marx, in that sense, he was completely right that economics determines everything, but it determines also through the ideology of economics. So my objective is really to give you the instrument by which you can understand when you have to read either the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, which are basically the main, economic newspapers in the world, or the International Herald Tribune, which is now called the International New York Times, Le Monde, whatever you want. And they address economic issues, or the economic issues get addressed indirectly, but still they're there, you'll be able to understand. That's what my objective is, okay? Now, so I hope that by the end of this session, we do away with Mars, close the chapter of understanding what Mars, well, we'll find him again, we'll meet him again later on, but we'll meet to understand the approach of Marx, and then we start neoclassical economics tomorrow. Now, in order to understand Marx, you must understand, in order to understand Marx, and to understand also certain fundamental issues in neoclassical economics, which is the main neoclassical economics is the main doctrine which dominates today, a set of doctrines based on market equilibria and so forth, which dominate today and have been dominating for essentially 100+ years, but really politically since the United States became the hegemonic power in the capitalist system, that is since 1945, in the world, I mean. And in order to understand Marx, you have to understand Ricardo. Without Ricardo, no Marx. David Ricardo. Okay? David Ricardo is the one who developed fully the labor theory of value. So write down, labor theory of value. And it is interesting to look at the way in which he developed. As I said last week, Adam Smith was concerned with long-term growth. That was Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the book says it all, The Wealth of Nations. Which is a polemic, not just a polemic, but it's a treatise against the mercantilist view of the economy. That is to say that gold and riches, the gold and the riches of the king determine the wealth. No, says Adam Smith, this is not true. The wealth of a nation is determined by production. So at the center of Adam Smith's analysis is production, okay? And in order to have production, you have to have food for the workers. If you don't have food for the workers, you have no possibility of having production. And how do you multiply production? Through what Adam Smith calls the accumulation of stocks. The accumulation of stocks means the fact that you have a surplus, okay, over and above what is currently consumed. And this surplus goes back as investment into the accumulation of capital. Therefore, the corn model, whereby corn is an input to production, both directly because you plant the corn, and indirectly because corn is a consumable item and it's the staple food for workers in England. It was treated as a staple food for workers. Then in Britain, then the corn model comes in very handy, okay, for that. Ricardo takes the corn model from Adam Smith. And his problem is growth linked to distribution. Why? Because of the context. The context is the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic War, Napoleon set up a blockade around England, okay? So no export and import, especially no import of grains from the United States. Because that's where corn was being imported into England. from the United States, from the former American colonies. No import of grains from the United States. Hence, the price of grains went up, which means that the rent obtained by the landlord went up. Okay? And people explain this situation whereby rent were growing during the Napoleonic Wars through the increase in the price of grains. They explained in terms of prices, of the increase in the price inflation due to the relative scarcity of grains because of lack of importations of grains from the United States. But Ricardo says, no, look, this is a contingent problem. That's contingent because of the Napoleonic War. But perhaps underneath there is a more serious problem of rent encroaching upon profits, okay, independently of the movement of market prices, because after all, market prices are contingent phenomena, okay? So Ricardo takes up that issue, the issue of the determination of income distribution, which in Adam Smith is not that marked, and Adam Smith was not concerned with it. He was concerned with increases in technology and in terms of increases in productivity. He takes up the Corn model and relates it to the issue of income distribution and capital accumulation. The elements are already in Adam Smith, because Adam Smith already pointed out that rent, the interest of the landlords and the interest of the capitalists, of the industrialists, are opposed to each other, okay? Because rent was considered to be a parasitic form of income spent on luxury, exactly like the physiocratic view of the aristocrats spending the rent that they received in kind from the peasants on luxury items, on Louis XVI chairs and so forth. Okay? Therefore, rent is considered to be as a non-productive type of expenditure when it is spent. It's not spent on capital accumulation, for the purposes of capital accumulation. So Ricardo takes that and he builds the Corn model. He really builds the Corn model in words, but it's mathematically extremely clear in the case of Ricardo. It can be easily translated in mathematics, and Luigi Pasinetti has done that, and it is in the first chapter, Brief Historical Excursus. The total output is defined in terms of price, profit, plus wages, plus rent. Okay? And this in the single, in a Corn model, where the whole output is reduced to one commodity, you don't need prices. You don't need prices. So what Ricardo shows is that rent over time is going to encroach upon profit. Why? Because he assumes wages, this is total wage bill, okay? And small w is the wage per worker times the number of workers. Wages are set at subsistence, so they cannot be lowered, right? Because this is the fundamental aspect of classical economics, which is already in Adam Smith. And Adam Smith then takes wages to grow over time because they are linked to productivity. Not in Ricardo. Ricardo's wages are at subsistence. That was a very important, actually it was a progressive view about wages, because wages were, if you take a historian of the period called Carlyle, who was writing that during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, you could see people dying in the fields, okay? Because wages were below subsistence. There were situations where people were dying of exhaustion as a result of the long working hours and very poor standard of living and so forth. So Ricardo argues that wages are at subsistence, because if wages fall below subsistence, capital accumulation itself will be impaired, since capital accumulation means the accumulation of stocks in the sense of Adam Smith, creation of more factories. And what do you put into the factories? You have to put workers into the factories, otherwise they won't be functioning. And in order to put workers into the factories, you have to have wages which are at least at subsistence, otherwise it's impossible to work, because the wages are at subsistence. And then the rate of profit, that's the variable, the rate of profit, that is to say profit over capital. And in this case, the profit over capital is really the profit over the wage bill, because in Ricardo, capital is actually the wage bill, is a wage fund notion of capital. You follow? Since wages are the necessary input into everything, right? Because otherwise you cannot have production, then capital and W, which is the total wage bill, are the same thing. You understand that? So capital is collapsed into the wage bill. To have capital accumulation, to have production, you need a wage fund. Otherwise, nothing will work. Okay, nothing will function. The rate of this would be the rate of profit. Under competition, which is also present in Adam Smith, but in Ricardo is analytically specified. Under competition, the rate of profit tends to equalize throughout. You understand? That you cannot have persistent, not so much as permanent, but persistent and regular divergences between different industries as far as profit rates are concerned. Why? The assumption is that under competition, you have free entry and exit of capital from in each sector of production. So if there is, in a particular sector, there is an innovating company, an innovating firm, or there is an innovation, that firm can enjoy above normal rate of profit only for a limited amount of time. Capital will flow into that sector, into the area where that firm operates, and this will eventually bring down the rate of profit to some uniform level. So rate of profits are uniformly determined through competition. Okay? There is this immanent tendency based on the assumption of free entry and free exit from in terms of time. And what about rent? Rent is linked in Ricardo to land. Okay? And land is linked to the production of food. Therefore, in Ricardo, you have the dynamics of differential rent. That is, first, the type of land that would be put under cultivation would be the most fertile, the most productive one. The first plot of land earns no rent at all. Okay? There is no rent there because it's the first plot of land. That is the most productive. This allows for the surplus over and above consumption. The result is that you will have net capital accumulation because the surplus is going to be invested. You follow? Then Ricardo brings in the theory of population of Thomas Malthus. In Thomas Malthus, if people, this is everybody's ascribed to it, Malthus formalized it, but basically that was the view that as people, it's also in Adam Smith, as people get more food, then they multiply. Okay? So, as they multiply, as population increases, you have to bring more land into cultivation. So capital accumulation generates net product generates higher consumption, the higher consumption generates more population, which would be good for the expansion of capital because we put these people into the factories to work, but at the same time we have to produce more food. The production of additional food requires that another batch of land be put under cultivation, and since you start from the most productive land, you move to the slightly less productive land. At this point you have rent, right? The rent is the difference between the yield of the top land to the second-rate land. And you go further and further, third rate. You come to a situation in which you have no longer the possibility of expanding, and the last, okay, and this means that you come to a situation whereby you end up in a stationary state in terms of the production of food. At that point, the rent prevents any further expansion of accumulation. There is no more net profit into the system. Everything goes into all the differential rents till the last plot of land which earns zero rent. Yes?
What is a stationary state?
Stationary state is you have no accumulation, stationary state. Year in and year out, you have exactly the same output. Okay? So stationary, no growth, no accumulation. Everything goes into the distribution of profits are only gross profit, no longer net profit, so only for replacement investment, okay? To replace the machinery, the stuff that goes out of use. You have no net capital accumulation, and basically profits are being squashed totally by rent. And this is independently of price increases, because there is no price mechanism here. Okay? Everything is one single product in terms of the core model. There is no price, so I don't have to define the price. Okay, when he wrote that in 1918, he wrote the first essay on the profit on corn, 1815, he sent it by email to Malthus, okay, who was at Jesus College, Cambridge. Sent it to him. Malthus gets it, and Malthus was a Marx hated. He completely hated. But Malthus gets the thing, the attachment, sees the paper, and Malthus was a parson, Jesus College, Cambridge. That's very important to understand. Was a parson, so a religious person, and a mathematician. It's important to understand this aspect. And he had this very fine logical mind. So Malthus reads this in day. This doesn't work. It works in the corn model. But what happens when you have many commodities? Many commodities. Corn model, you have one good, you define like GDP, one good, right? And you define, you don't need the price system. Oh, says Ricardo. And he wrote a whole book about it as a result. His famous book on the principles of political economy and taxation is the reply to Malthus. That's what it is, a whole book, which made famous, Ricardo has become famous, not for the first essay, but for the whole book, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817. He sends it. Sends it to Malthus. Malthus reads it and says, okay, I'll tell you now in a second. What does Ricardo come up with in his book, Principles of Political Economy of Taxation? He comes up with the labor theory of value. The very labor theory of value that was discarded by Adam Smith. The quantity of labor time necessary to produce commodities determines the relative prices of commodities. In other words, if it takes say, 2 hours to produce this. It's not a pen, it's kind of strange thing. Anyway, this pen, 2 hours, and it takes 1 hour to produce these glasses, €9.90. Okay? It takes 1 hour to produce these glasses. Then it means that 2 glasses will exchange with 1 pen, because the pen takes 2 hours to produce, the glasses take 1 hour to produce. Okay? So this was, and there is nothing you can do about it. Okay? It's determined therefore by the technology of the system. Because what determines the quantity of labor time to produce these things is the technology, right? It's the technology, the dexterity of people to work with their hands and so forth in a factory system in the sense of Adam Smith. So it depends on the technology of the system. And that's it. So they said, look, I have in a multi-commodity world, I get exactly the same results in the single commodity world as in the case of the core model, right? By using the labor theory value. I use the labor theory value that tells me how prices are determined. These are long-term prices, are not short-term prices fluctuating demand and supply. These are long-term prices which are determined by the real social cost of production. The real social cost of production is indeed, in classical economics, the attractor, the gravitational element of all prices, market prices, other type of prices that you have. They gravitate around and toward the real social cost of production, which is determined by the labor time necessary to produce those each and every commodity. Okay? So Malthus reads this and says, Dave, you've got a problem. There's a problem. The problem is that you'll be right. If, and this is not something that Adam Smith saw already, but Malthus elaborated on it. You'll be right only if the proportion of direct, in fact, only if 2 things happen, either or. First, that all commodities are produced by hand only, by pure labor. Yeah, pure labor, no machinery, no so that. By pure labor, then you can measure everything in labor time. So the difference in labor time needed to produce commodities will, in fact, determine the relative prices. But this doesn't happen because we have implements of production, we had hand looms. There was not perhaps so much as machine-operated looms, mechanical looms, but they were hand looms, there were horse-drawn stuff, wind-propelled machinery, and so forth. So, at that point, when you have machinery, when you have means of production, the labor theory value holds only if the proportion of direct labor, which is the labor which actually produces the commodity, the proportion of direct labor to indirect labor, that is the labor embodied in the production of the machinery, is the same in every single sector. Okay? Because then everything is determined as if it was produced by labor alone. It's the same thing, because past labor stays exactly in the same proportion as present labor. Okay? You follow? So if in sector A, in this sector, in this production of pen, the proportion of indirect labor, then the labor that goes into producing the machines, is the same to the living labor, the labor that goes into the direct production of this stuff. As in here, if the proportion are the same, it is as if you were using the labor theory, direct labor only. It's the same. Because you go back and you get exactly the same proportion of time, okay? You follow? But only under those conditions. However, why should this be the case? Because the proportion of direct to indirect labor is also known as the technique of production. If the technique of production is different, clearly the proportions between machinery and labor, or labor and machinery, will be different from sector, from branch to branch in the economy, and therefore the labor theory of value, as conceived by Ricardo, has got a flaw there, it's got a problem, doesn't hold, doesn't gel. The thing doesn't gel. So, Ricardo replies, I think Twitter, I think it was used Twitter, replies to Malthus, saying, get off my back, you know. I think that my theory is valid 93% of the time. And this is what the Chicago economist in the 50s, George Stigler, called it the 93, I don't know whether he said 93 or 97. Anyway, it doesn't matter, 90 something. He said the 93% labor theory of value. Okay, that's what George Stigler wrote in the Journal of Political Economy in the mid-50s, wrote a very important article in that respect. So, Marx sees these things of Ricardo, right? Gets terribly upset. He says, yeah, it's all in volume 2 and the introduction to, in his notebooks on the Grundrisse and in his fourth volume of Capital, which is Theory of Surplus Value. He says, Ricardo made a fundamental mistake. He conceded. He should not have conceded to Malthus. He should have defended the labor theory of value. He should have absolutely defended it, and I'm going to do it for him. Volume 3 of Capital. That's all what Volume 3 of Capital is about. The defense of the labor theory of value, plus Marx's own monetary theory. That's what Volume 3 of Capital is about. So the interesting thing is why Ricardo needed the labor theory of value and why Marx needed the labor theory of value even more than Ricardo. Okay? But it's the Ricardian labor theory of value. So, in Ricardo, what Ricardo wanted is complete separation between, listen to this carefully, because that's what defines classical economics, complete separation between value and distribution. Value are prices, relative prices. So, in what proportion these two things exchange, okay? Distribution is how the total output is distributed between profits, wages, and rent, okay? You wanted total separation because you wanted to focus on distribution. So you can see that if a commodity, values of commodities, are determined by the quantity of labor time necessary to produce them, and that is it, that is to say, by the technology of the economy, they are unaffected, the values are unaffected by distribution. Do you agree with me on that? Because what determines the value, the social cost of production, is the quantity, the amount of labor that you put into producing things. So that's irrelevant. That doesn't enter into distribution. Then distribution is determined in a different sphere. Do you understand that? You follow me? An important corollary is that if this is so, assuming now that this is so, and what does an increase in wages do? What happens when wages increase?
The workers, and they will take less time to do the things.
No, when the amount of time necessary to produce commodities is determined by the technology by the labor input required to produce a commodity. So this is technically determined. There's nothing you can do about it. If wages increase, what happens? Yes? Yes?
The distribution changes.
Exactly, distribution changes. This is very important. This is not prices. Adam Smith, who does not get, he doesn't hold on to the labor theory of value. If wages go up, prices go up. Okay? In the case, and he was right actually, I'm not now going to, Adam Smith was right. But I'm not going now into his right, his wrong, and I just to explain with you. And in the case of Ricardo, if wages go up, they affect distribution, not the value of the commodity, because the value of the commodity is determined by the quantity of labor time necessary to produce those commodities, and that is it. There's nothing you can do about it. Don't get on to my nerves. Okay, that's basically the thing. So he separates price values from distribution in this way, and he focuses on the conflict between profits and rents. So why Marx needs that? Even more than Ricardo. Even more than Ricardo. Yes?
Because she was more concerned about the wages of the workers.
Marx was a bad guy. He didn't love people. So
Or he lost too many.
No, he didn't love people. You know the story about, you know that the motto, proletarians of the world unite, right? This is the Socialist International motto, right? It was not suggested, it was not the first motto to be suggested like that. The first motto was some English, British trade unionist, you know, with beer and stuff, you know, said, in the first, when they decided about this slogan, they suggested, let's say all men are brothers. That was the word. And Marx, not because he was a feminist, he wasn't, but Marx says, look, I don't want to be brother to most people. I don't really want to. Let's have proletarians of the world unite. Okay? It's a completely abstract way of thinking. No, it's not because of wages. It was not English. Marx needs the labor theory of value, and therefore the distribution, the separation between distribution and value, separation. So he needs the same thing of Ricardo, because he wants to evince, to bring out what are the sources of profits. In Ricardo, you don't have the sources of profit. It doesn't explain. Okay? Output is divided, resolves itself between profits, wages, and rent. Okay? Value is determined by the quantity of labor time necessary to produce commodities. In the case of Marx, value contains profit. You follow? So what he does, first of all, he eliminates this relationship. Capital is not wages and capital. Wages are part of capital in Marx, but they are not the same thing as physical capital. Physical capital is one thing, machinery, and wages are another thing. So what he does, now it's very easy to explain in words, then I put the formulation. What he does, he establishes the total amount of time necessary to produce commodities. See if one goes, how does one go further? I forgot. How you turn the page here? You do something.
Next,
Huh?
when you look, there is the bar. Did you see?
No, I don't see it. Where? Huh? Here, this one.
A little bit on the right of that one, what you were pointing right now.
Here?
A little bit more. That.
Ah. No, I remember that before I used to change.
And then there is extend fades.
Okay, anyway, let's extend it by G. Well, doesn't extend it. Okay, here. So he divides the total value of the commodity. Let's go by using the German Mayhem agreement. And so why does it have? I did this thing in the fashion. Prefer the traditional techniques. So this is the value of the commodity. And it is equal to 3 components. Surplus value plus what he calls variable capital plus what he calls constant capital. What are these components? Constant capital is machinery and raw materials. Machinery plus raw materials. Variable capital is what in Ricardo would be wages. This total capital. Surplus value is the value.
Is it a reduction?
No, it's not. Is the value produced by the worker, by variable capital, which does not go back to the worker as wage. You follow? So, why is C constant capital? Why is it called machinery? Why does it put machinery and raw material as constant capital? Why is it called constant? It calls it constant. Constant means something that doesn't change, right? Constant because it only transfers into the final commodity, it transfers its own value. Do you follow me? It transfers its own labor time. The labor time, which is, as Marx says, congealed, frozen into C, because this is machinery, so it's past labor time, right? Machinery has been produced yesterday, applied today. Therefore, the constant capital, the labor time that goes into the production of constant capital, as production takes place, gets transferred into the final value. Okay? No additional value is added to the system. You understand? Constant capital transfers the variable. It is precisely considered so because it transfers its additional value to the final commodity. And this additional value is the surplus value. Why? It's simple. What Marx says, this is important, it comes from his German philosophical understanding of Ricardo. And that's why he needs Ricardo desperate. He's desperate. He needs Ricardo. So, because he says, look, what you see, there is a formally legal contract between the workers and the capitalists. Okay? Workers are free to come, free to go, and capitalists are free to hire and free to fire. Okay? It's free, keeps therefore the same view. There is free mobility of both labor and capital in the system. Okay? Capital moves from sector to sector. Workers are free to decide to go to work to a better employer. Okay, if they find jobs in better occupations. You follow me? In better paid occupation. So there is no binding. It's not a feudal system. Workers are not owned by the capitalists. They are not owned. It's not. And in fact, for Marx, a system of slavery is not consistent with the capitalist economy, with the capitalist mode of production. He never used the term capitalist. Marx in Capital never used the term capitalist economy, never used the term capitalism. Never. Capitalism comes from French sociological blah blah. Does not come from Marx. Marx always used the capitalist mode of production. It's very important because it defines the conditions of production all the time, the technical, institutional, legal conditions of production. So, in the capitalist mode of production, people are not owned, unlike the system of slavery, right? So people are not horses, people are not oxen. They are free to go. And yet, it argues that the contract, which appears to be a contract among equal, contains the element of exploitation, of domination of capital over labor. Something that it gets also from Adam Smith, because in Adam Smith there is this element, although it's not specified the way in which Marx specifies it. Okay? And what is the element of domination of capital over labor? The fact that, okay, the capitalist, the firm hires you to work, say, 10 hours and pays you for 5 hours. So how come? But I get, let's say $10 an hour. $10 by 10 is 100, so I'm getting $100. The contract says $10 an hour, okay? 10 by 10 is equal 100. So why do you say that I paid only 5? And it says Marx. Go to a shop, okay? Buy the stuff with those $100, and then ask yourself how many hours are needed to produce the stuff that you bought. Okay? And you'll find out that only 5 hours are needed. I'm making this example. Only 5 hours are needed. So you have worked 10 hours. You have been paid $10 an hour, or 10 euros, whatever, by 10, 100. But when you go to the shop, the stuff that you buy, your means of subsistence, they contain only 5 hours of work. This means that you have really worked 5 hours for free for the business enterprise in order to generate surplus value.
So for Marx, wages are not a level of subsistence, are they?
No, they are subsistence.
They are?
Yeah. They are subsistence.
And what about the other 5 hours? I mean, he works...
Capital accumulation, surplus.
Oh, okay. Not for the workers though.
Capital accumulation, by definition, cannot be for the worker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
the
he needs to
worker
spend then. He will spend all of his money at the end of the week or whatever.
Of the day. Let's keep it
The
at
day.
the level of the day. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
So I don't understand the example you just made.
I'm sorry?
I don't understand. Maybe I don't really understand the example of the wage and the hours and the fact that he works for 5 hours for free.
Okay, let's use the core model.
Okay.
You have agricultural workers, labor. They are paid in corn, in grains, in rice, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Okay? They get in their salary half of the harvest. The other half of the harvest is for capital accumulation. That is surplus, and therefore it means for replanting, for expanding. Okay, it's the same thing. But in corn, you can do it without prices because you get half of the harvest as workers. You have worked, but you produce all of the harvest. You work 10 hours a day in the field to produce the harvest. You get to plant and to till the land, and then to actually harvest the land. And therefore, but you get only half of it. Yeah?
Okay.
And the same thing happens in the legal contract between the capitalist and the worker, but it's all defined in money terms. It's all defined, I pay you $10 an hour, you work 10 hours, $100. When you spend that money, it's like having half of the harvest.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Because you don't get the 100% back of the product. you get half of it. Where does the other half go? It goes to capital accumulation, to the increase in the stock of capital and to the increase in variable capital by hiring new workers. Okay? It's like you plant the surplus of corn, you put it back, therefore you need more workers, more peasants, more agricultural laborers to till the additional land that you are going to use if you plant back the surplus of corn. So Ricardo doesn't get profits out of a production process. It's the value of, is that output resolves itself, is split into profits, wages, and rent. That's what he gets. Marx from Ricardo gets what he thinks is the source of profit. That is to say, the fact that there is a component which does not add any value to output. It increases output if it's technologically more modern, but it does not increase the value of output. It only transfers its own value into the final product. That's the machinery, because it's dead labor, because it has been produced by labor in the past. It's dead labor which gets transferred into the final product. Then there is living labor, which is the wage, the variable capital. It's called variable because it adds additional value through surplus value, that is through the amount of time for which the workers is not paid. But this amount of time for which the workers is not paid does not show up legally, because everyone is paid $10 an hour. Okay? It's only if you calculate the amount of hours necessary to produce the means of subsistence of the workers. Okay? Then you will find that they are less than the number of hours that are bestowed, put into production. And this is the source of the surplus. Okay? Value is determined exactly as in Ricardo, by the quantity of labor time necessary to produce commodities. Okay? So you have this is indirect labor, so the quantity of labor time of dead labor. This is direct labor, variable capital, and variable capital generates the surplus, and this creates the number of the value of the commodity. Okay? This is Marx. Now, out of that, Marx derives a certain number of propositions which are quite significant, and so I will then write again this C plus B plus S equal M. Then the rate of profit in Marx R is determined by the surplus value, you see, divided by total capital. That's what the rate of profit is. So total capital is constant plus variable capital. You see, in Ricardo, in Ricardo, capital and wages are the same. It's the wage fund. In Marx, no. In Marx, they are not the same because he introduces the notion of machinery, constant capital, machinery produced in the past, the role of which is to be more technically efficient, but in terms of value, it simply transfers its own value into the final commodity. Then, that's the first proposition. The second proposition that you have in Ricardo, in Marx, is that the rate of profit is positively related, okay, to surplus. So if you can squeeze the workers more, the rate of profit goes up because the surplus value increases, and it is negatively related to both constant capital and variable capital. Okay? Variable capital is understandable. Variable capital means wages. So, rate of profit and wage rate move in the opposite direction. And this is also in Ricardo, but Ricardo kept wages and subsistence, so he essentially focused on the relationship between profits and rent. In the case of Marx, rents disappear. There are no rents in Marx, not because there are no rents in the economy, but because rents are fully capitalistic rents in Marx. So rents in Marx are part of profits, and Marx was completely correct about that, absolutely correct. So he moves away from the differential rent, land-based rent of Ricardo, but he introduces fully capitalistic rent, like the rent that you have in buildings here in any city and so forth. That's it. It's completely capitalistic rent. It's part of the profit that then gets spread around in terms of rent and all sorts of financial values and so forth. So, the rate of profit becomes, you see, it's here, it's in the denominator, okay? So it's negatively related, because if this goes up, the ratio goes down. Therefore, rate of profit is negatively related to constant capital, negatively related to wages, to variable capital, and positively related to surplus value. But let me specify this more, which is also in the Pasinetti paper. And we can write if we can divide this, then nothing will change if I write like this. Okay? Divide everything by V plus 1. You follow me? Because V over V is 1. Okay? So S over V divided by C over V plus 1, because V over V is 1. Okay? So I can call S over V, I can call it let's say, how should I call it? Beta. And I can call C over V gamma. Okay? And at this point I substitute, and I have the rate of profit is very simple, beta over gamma plus 1. Okay? That's not totally an interesting compact version of this relation. That tells you exactly that the rate of profit is positively related to the rate S over V is the beta is the rate of surplus value, the rate of surplus value. That is to say, the proportion between unpaid, S is the unpaid amount of time, and V is the paid amount of time in production. Okay? This is beta. So it's positively related to beta, and it is negatively related to gamma. But what is gamma? Gamma is interesting. C over V is the relationship between capital, physical capital, labor embodied in physical machinery, and labor as variable capital, living labor. C over V defines the technique of production in the system. Okay? Is the technique of production in the system. Out of this relation, Marx gets the first ever theory of business cycle. It's out of this. He gets the first ever theory of the business cycle and the first ever theory of unemployment. That's his big thing. That is the big, all the rest, capitalism dies, survival, it's all, it's all up to you. But this is the big thing of Marx, which is relevant even today. You must always consider the theory of the business cycle of Marx, whether it applies or not, etc. But it is there. It's the most important in contemporary terms results of Marx, volume 1 of Capital, which I will speak about in about 11.5 minutes. Come back from the break. Okay?
So Marx hated Malthus because he disrupted the...
But Marx hated Malthus also. Number one, because he was a Catholic, was a religious person. Number two, because Malthus was in favor. Malthus was very smart. Malthus was in favor of servants. Not was in favor of having servants in society. But why did he say that? Because he said, if we don't have servants, who is going to consume the servant? You see? So there was a sort of chaos at time for Malthus, because where is the demand coming from? If everything is oriented toward capital accumulation, where is the demand coming from? So he was in favor of servants. It's because we have servants, so we can provide consumption, to society, because servants work for us, we pay them, and they have consumption. Otherwise, there would not be enough demand in the economy. Well, that wasn't stupid, but Marx hated the fact that he justified the existence of servants, although he had the servants. Okay? But that's the difference. And so, one servant was the servant of his wife. Dame de chambre. A whole story happened there. And, he blamed the angels, but it was not true. And so, this is the... So he was against the social context of Malthus very much, as he was against many other people that we'll talk about later. Okay, so... So let's see how this story works out in Marx in terms of the formulation of the first theory ever of the business cycle. Of course, we cannot just blame the others prior to Marx, before Marx, for not having developed the theory of the business cycle, simply because the cycles were not so apparent. I mean, the cycle in Marx is an industrial cycle, and therefore Ricardo wrote when still in Britain most of the population live on agriculture in the country, so we cannot just blame. But when all is said and done, Marx is the first to have developed a fully coherent theory of the business cycle. And it is important to understand the role that plays in it, the labor theory value. Now, there is a little booklet by Marx, which is, all of Marx is available online in English, okay? It's the Moscow, always go to Moscow, always. It's the Moscow edition, which is the one that has been Moscow and Berlin, German Democratic Republic edition of Marx, which is the best, still the best. You know, if you think, I mean, people talk about Stalin, okay, all those sort of stuff, yes. But in 1941, the Nazis were near Moscow, just outside Moscow, okay? And the Institute of Marxism-Leninism of Moscow, of the Soviet Union, publishes the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse are called the notebooks, the Grundrisse. And they publish them, it's not Stalin published them, there are philologists, there were people who, and they still the best this way, because people say, oh, why wasn't it published before? They wanted to hide it, because there are many, in the Grundrisse, Marx actually rediscusses many of his theories, okay? He has second thoughts and all that sort of stuff, and perhaps changes something, but it is not, these are just thoughts that he puts right down in the Grundrisse. And they were published, we said they wanted to hide. They did not want to hide because they were published in 1941, not toward the end of 41. End of 41 is the Battle of Moscow. That's where the end of 41, right? So they published that thing. So, and the philological and epistemological work on the manuscripts of Marx and Engels is absolutely immaculate. It's absolutely perfect. There is no interference with the outside sort of ideology or dogmatism, etc. By far better than the one that was done by the Social Democrats in Germany before the First World War. Was Karl Kautsky, who was the head of the Social Democracy, and he's the one who first published the 3-volume of Capital in Marx, but he rewrote, he used to rewrite. And that's what one of the things that the Institute of Marxism-Leninism in Moscow did, is to take away all the Kautsky addition to Das Kapital. And so, there is a booklet which is called Value, Price and Profit, which you can find online. And it's also in the, I think it's among the readings that I have put on Moodle through Antonio. And if you want to look at it. And this is Marx's speech at the first international, at the founding meeting of the first international in London. Okay? He was asked to speak, he gave a talk, and the talk is usually the case with Marx. Talks, he attacks somebody else. Yeah? He always attacks somebody else. Okay? And there was a trade unionist called Western citizen, they called themselves like in the French Revolution, citoyen, citizen Western, who said, what is the meaning of struggling for higher wages? Every time we struggle for higher wages, we get higher prices. So what's the point? And Western was right. He was right, but he was a bit ahead of his time. Marx just lashes out at him. All this booklet is an attack on Western. An attack on Western. But the importance of that booklet is that it's a very good summary of Das Kapital. It's a very good summary. It's basically a Reader Digest of Das Kapital. You can get the essence of Marx, because that's what really was being interviewed by CNN, BBC, and etc. What he really believed in, yeah? Because he had to express himself on something concrete. Do wages generate wage increases absorbed, nullified by higher prices or not? And he lashes out at Western, saying no. He's Ricardian to the very end. He's Ricardian. He said, no, wages do not create price. Increasing wages does not lead to price increases. And increasing wages changes the distribution of income. in favor of workers. But in changing the distribution of income in favor of workers, it reduces the rate of capital accumulation. And by reducing the rate of capital accumulation, it generates unemployment. But it says even the increase in wages, okay, is not determined by the workers themselves. Don't you think that unions will impact upon the long-run tendencies in wages? Increase in wages are determined by capital itself. It's capital which creates the conditions for wages to increase. Wages increase, distribution of income changes, and capital accumulation changes the pattern, its pattern as a result of it. This is much. Therefore, it is wrong to consider that wages will increase prices, will affect prices. So it's completely consistent with the labor theory of value, whereby prices and distribution, values and distribution are separate, okay? Because in Marx, an increase in wages does not impact upon prices, but rather on distribution, okay? Now, this is important to see. So, he builds, starting from chapter 25 in the Moscow edition of Capital, Volume 1, but in that booklet as well, and then toward till the end of the Volume 1 of Capital, he builds a whole mechanism, dynamics, genesis, and dynamics of capitalist system. The problem, I found that the problem is that the genesis comes at the end, okay? The dynamics comes first, and the genesis is at the end. It's the last part of Volume 1. I would have, if I were Marx, I would have written the genesis before, because of it's sequentially better. But it doesn't matter. We'll keep that. So I now rework in the proper chronological order. In Marx, capitalism comes out of the capitalist mode of production, is a process that comes out of the previous, of the feudal system. Okay? So it's not born out of nothing. It is born out of the process by which conditions for capital accumulation are generated. I think that on the genesis or certain aspect of the genesis, Marx is very weak. But perhaps I'm reading this with more recent, 20th century stuff, historical results, but that's how. So at the beginning, this is the nutshell of his argument. At the beginning, the capitalist core is very small. Keep this and just move it here. Very small capitalist core, okay? Which is surrounded by pre-capitalist formations. These pre-capitalist formations are based on two things, essentially. The people living and eating cabbages on communal land. So it's before the enclosures. Before, the 17th century Britain, where the process of the enclosure, whereby land was privatized. That was it was. People lived on land that formerly was owned by the church, by and large by the churches, but they were living there eating cabbages, they were kind of scratching themselves and doing all these sort of things. That they had sort of natural right to live on the land, on that land. But then, out. With the enclosure, they were booted out, okay? And then if you look at it carefully, it started with Cromwell in Cromwell. Cromwell is the person who transformed the period in which England was transformed from a kind of sheepskin wearing, primitive place into capitalist economy, into a capitalist system. And it started in a big way in Ireland, right? Because Ireland, the people had to be kicked out in order for Ireland to become a sheep walk for British textile production in Manchester, Lancashire, and so forth. So, and Marx has that in mind all the time because he also wrote about Ireland and so forth. So this is one part. So the people who were not yet workers, who were not even peasants, but they lived and they cultivated the land, of course, to survive on cabbages, etc., in the hinterland. And then the other component is what Marx calls the petty commodity production in the towns, that is the cities, the artisans, essentially the artisans. The feature of this capitalist core is one very important, that it has a productive dynamic much higher than petty commodity production. It does not necessarily have better quality, it does not have necessarily has more advanced stuff, but it has a more productive capacity. It has greater technological dynamics. And therefore, it starts like a cancer, it starts expanding, okay? To expand, it requires raw materials. Where do raw materials come from? From the country, right? Mines, food for the people, for the workers that work here. No matter how low wages are, they still need food. Therefore, it has to transform the country, the hinterland, into something which is functional to this capital, to this process of accumulation, which it is more efficient in terms of productive capacities than petty commodity production. Petty commodity is not necessarily bound with accumulation, exactly like the artisans in the physiocrats are not orientated toward accumulation. The same thing in Marx, petty commodity production is not orientated, it can be artisans in Venice, Florence, Siena, and so forth. Excellent stuff, not orientated toward capital accumulation, okay? Whereas this thing is orientated toward capital accumulation, and therefore it requires raw materials from the country. Therefore, the country cannot be allocated to the subsistence of the people who live on it. It has to be allocated to the needs of capital accumulation. You follow me? It has to be transformed into a source of food and raw materials. Okay? So these people that live here, have to come here as what? As wage earners. In other words, as proletarians, because they lose their means of subsistence. Land is privatized through the enclosures. They get kicked out. Some of the land becomes sheepwalk, like in Scotland, like in Ireland, and so forth. Some the land becomes available for mining. Some of the land becomes available for cultivations. Okay, so these are cultivations in order to provide the food that is the wage fund for the town. So we are in the core model. That's perfectly okay. Yeah? It works also with the labor theory of value. And as these people flock here, because there are very many, they are being made redundant in the country, the wages go down. Okay? So initially, technology cannot change that much because we are still in the primitive stage of capital accumulation. So gamma, which is the relationship between C over V, that is to say, the technique of production in the economy, gamma is more or less stable. Okay? For a while, gamma is gamma bar, which is stable, but it doesn't change that much. And all the emphasis is here. So beta, surplus value. Beta is S over V. Okay? The emphasis is here. So surplus value goes up because wages go down. You follow me? Wages go down, so surplus value goes up as a result of wages going down. Because there's plenty of labor, surplus labor, there's unemployment therefore. The country generates unemployment, it's being privatized. People get booted out, they have to migrate. They migrate to Manchester, they migrate to Lancashire. Okay? And the reference is always Britain in the case of Marx. And as they migrate to Manchester and Lancashire, plenty of them come, wages go down. The wages go down, and the rate of surplus value goes up. So rate of accumulation gathers momentum. Okay? As it gathers momentum, it enters into competition with the petty commodity producers, the artisans. The artisans go bankrupt because they have the other sector is more efficient in that respect. It operates on competitive basis. It tends to use always the most advanced, as a result of the free movement of capital, the most advanced technique of production available, and therefore the petty commodity producers, they go bankrupt. The artisans go bankrupt, etc., etc. And so also the towns themselves, the artisans become unemployed, and so forth. They produce labor for the capitalist sector. And this means that still this goes up. This can change as long as this changes, as long as technology becomes more capitalistic. So this has to go up because technology, gamma, is C over D, okay? It's machinery over labor. So if it becomes more mechanized, more capitalistic, gamma goes up. It encroaches negatively on the rate of profit, but as long as beta goes up faster than gamma, that's okay. If beta goes up faster than gamma, the ratio actually widens, and therefore the rate of profit and the rate of accumulation goes up, okay? They both go up. So, there are limits to this. This doesn't happen at an infinite horizon. There are limits. Each limit, there is a contingent limit. The contingent limit is determined by the fact that there are technological barriers. There is so much that you can keep the peasants out, you know, because it is determined by the technology of producing food, of producing agriculture, and so forth. So in every stage, there is a limit to the process. Okay? But Marx pushes the argument till its very logical end. And the logical end is that eventually all this system, which is, say, let's call it the world, okay? Because he thinks on the world basis, becomes like the core. The entire world is fully transformed into a capitalistic system. Do you follow? So everyone is absorbed into the advanced sector. Do you follow me? So the advanced sector becomes the whole economy. You understand? You understand that? Okay. At this point, however, as you start approaching this stage where the capitalist system becomes completely globalized, to use a stupid contemporary becomes the world system, as the great historian, French historian Prof says, becomes the world system, which is much better than global. Global is stupid. Global is so stupid. The term is idiotically stupid. Idiotically stupid. Stupid twice. And so, because it means that everybody is the same, it means that there are no differences in culture, it means it's profoundly stupid. But anyway, as this becomes the world system, as you approach, well, the supply of labor, obviously, the rate at which the supply of labor proceeds starts to fall short of the rate at which capital accumulation proceeds. Right? The rate at which the supply of labor proceeds, goes on, will begin to slow down relatively to the pace of capital accumulation. Okay? So this means that capital will have more and more difficulties in getting labor. But capital doesn't stop. Capital doesn't stop at this kind of obstacle. Capital, the capacity of capital in Marx is that it can always, except for a point that we'll come to it in a second, it will always manage to overcome its difficulties. Capital never gets stuck into its own crisis, so to speak, its own difficulty. It always has the productive capacity, the technological force to break through. That this Marx has a very revolutionary view of capital, by the way. It's not capital is bad, workers are poor, oh, we are all crying because they are poor. There's nothing in Marx, there's nothing of that. Nothing ever, okay? Capital is a progressive force insofar as it develops the means of production, the technologies, the capacity to expand. It is a progressive force. As long as it is enables to eliminate pre-existing elements at all levels, it's a progressive force. But as capital runs out of the supply of labor, what you have here is that the wage rate will start rising. Okay? So V will rise. If V rises, beta goes down. If V rises relative to S, beta goes down. Okay? You follow? So the rate of capital accumulations, that's the cycle. So we are coming to the turning point of the cycle. The rate of capital accumulation starts to slow down because V is rising. There are not enough workers, let's say, that in contemporary terms, parlance, we would say that the economy is reaching full employment. It is getting near full employment. As the economy gets near full employment, wages rise. Okay? They do not affect, remember, he's always consistent with his theoretical approach. Marx is never inconsistent. Okay? He's never, but this is true for Adam Smith as well, for Ricardo. They were always extremely consistent with their own theoretical approaches. So, as wages rise, they don't affect prices, which is what Citizen Western argues, right? And Marx said, no, we are totally wrong, okay? So, it's not that wages rise, it's not that prices rise. What happens is that income distribution changes, and it changes through the rise in V, variable capital, which represents wages. This is surplus value, this is the amount of labor which is unpaid. So if this ratio shrinks, because V rises, the rate of capital accumulation slows down, even if gamma remains the same. Remember, the economy is always operating under competition, not perfect competition. The notion of perfect competition, we'll find it later in neoclassical economics. In the classics, we have competition. It means that firms cannot hang on to exceptional rate of profit, that the rate of profit tends to be uniform throughout, through the free mobility of capital. And this is one of the reasons that they cannot increase prices. These firms do not control the market, okay? They do not control prices, which will not be true today, by the way. That's one thing that we have immediately to say. Today, this is not true, okay? Today, firms tend to be, if you go to any management school, okay, any business school, they will tell you that you are successful if your firm becomes a price maker, not a price taker. That's the first thing that they tell you in business schools. Therefore, okay, after having taught you that perfect competition is the best thing you can get on earth, and so forth, then they tell you, as a business manager, you have to strive to be outside perfect competition, try to be price maker, not price taker. Okay? In Marx, firms do not determine prices. Why? Because prices are determined by the quantity of labor necessary to produce commodities, and that is it. So the only thing that firms can do is to always be on the frontier of production. That is, always have the most advanced technology at hand. That's what they can do. So what happens here? When the rate of profit shrinks, the rate of capital accumulation shrinks, reduces, then the intake of labor into the economy slows down. So you have the formation of a little bit of unemployment, okay? It's a bit of unemployment. So already things get... sort of sorted out because there is a bit of unemployment and wages cannot rise any further or cannot rise as much as they were rising before. You understand that? Because they have unemployment. There's always an impact of unemployment on wages in mass, always. Then, but this it's only the beginning, it's the beginning of the story. Then firms, because they are subject to a profit squeeze, they get less profit. They cannot increase prices because they operate under competition. So what do they do? What do firms do? Okay, well, they have to introduce new technologies. That's the only way, right? And since labor, the wage has been the factor that squeezed the profits out. Okay, therefore, they have to introduce labor-saving technologies. So in Mars, there is a perfectly correct labor-saving bias in technological change. Why? Because the profit squeeze starts from wages. As a result of the fact that capital accumulation has been so successful, gobbled up the land, gobbled up everything, and gobble, that they run out of labor. Having run out of labor, wages rise, obviously, and as wages rise, profits get squeezed. But the only way in which you can solve the issue under competition is by introducing new technologies. There is no other alternative. You agree with me on that? That's it. So they introduce labor-saving technology. That's the first thing that you have to do. Okay? So you don't have people from the agriculture, etc., because the whole world has become capitalistic now, and therefore you don't have outside sources unless you start bringing Martians into onto Earth. So this is the first step. So the second step, they introduce labor-saving technologies. Okay. What do labor-saving technology do? Well, they increase C over V. They increase gamma. Right? But labor-saving technologies are also more productive. Okay, you use a labor-saving not just to save labor, but it increases capacity, it increases productivity. So labor-saving technologies have two faces to them, two faces. First is that they increase gamma, they increase C over V. But then they can also increase productivity. You follow? And therefore, they can also increase better. That is, if I introduce a labor-saving technology which increases productivity by 10%, okay, but I can still have an increase in wages of 3%, and still I gain 7%. So, in this context, they can increase better, they can increase the rate of surplus value as well, okay? But all this is calculated in labor time. In the amount, this is the amount of hours, that work, okay? This cannot go more than so much. You cannot have workers working 100% of the time for the firm and zero for themselves. They must work a bit for themselves as well, otherwise they won't have any food, right? Remember that the variable capital is calculated on the basis of the number of hours that the workers get back when they go and buy things in the shops, right? So, in the GDP, it's a GDP concept here, basically. In the GDP, what is the part of the GDP that you buy back with your wage? Okay, that's basically it. And so you cannot have 0% of GDP for yourself, because it means that you get no food, okay? And 100% for the firm. It's impossible. Therefore, there is a limit. This can increase. So initially, gamma and beta can go together in the sense gamma can enhance beta. Yes?
I have a question. What do you mean by increase in productivity exactly? Like the reduction of the necessary time to build more
That's
products,
right, the reduction of necessary time.
How does it increase S over V, surplus over V? Because it reduces V,
Because you
increases S.
Because if you have, let's say that in order to feed yourself, the working class, in order to feed itself, it requires, let's say, 60% of the total GDP, right? An increase in productivity may reduce the amount of necessary time, okay, to feed themselves to 50% of GDP.
Yeah, but only if this increase in productivity is done in the industry that produces food for the workers, because if after increase the productivity of what the workers produce, they reduce also the time necessary.
This
doesn't match.
No, it does match, because we are calculating in terms. It does match if you accept the premise of Marx of the labor theory of value. That is, we are calculating the socially necessary amount of time necessary to produce commodities. Okay, so it is as if we were thinking in terms of GDP, of national of what's called today GDP. GDP is the total value in terms of hours work of national income. Okay, so if the increase in productivity allows for the national income that goes back to the workers to be reduced, say, from 60 to 50%, then the increase in productivity brought by more capital-intensive technique of production, this increase in productivity allows also the increase in beta. That's what it is. Yeah. So when this happens, I want to finish the story of Marx, okay? But behind your argument is the perception that perhaps the single sector model that is not working. Yeah, the single sector model is not working, but I cannot give you this answer now, okay? Because we would be too advanced. So we need some time to get to it. So Marx, the introduction of more capital-intensive techniques is consistent with the increase in the rate of profit and the restarting of accumulation as long as it helps better. Okay? This happens in a big way at the third phase of Marx cycle. The third phase is that not all firms will be able to undertake this change. All right, statistically, there's no reason why all firms will be able to jump to the new technique. Yeah? There's absolutely no reason. But in addition to that, he argues that, well, there are firms which have more level of debt, because his system always operates on credits. Huh? In his system, there is always the credit mechanism that works. So, firms have different level of debts. There will be firms that will not manage to, there will be quite many of them, he argues, they will not manage to make this change. This firm will go bankrupt. And this is the turning point of the cycle. Okay, the real turning point of the cycle, where the depression generates growth in Marx. Remember that. The depression generates growth because all these firms go bankrupt, workers and capitalists become unemployed. So he says, capital expropriates not only the workers through the surplus value mechanism, 10 hours, 5 hours, that sort of stuff, but capital expropriates the capitalists as well through the process of concentration of capital. Okay? So, firms go bankrupt, they fire all the workers, they close down, so this capital essentially disappears or gets absorbed by the units which have succeeded in doing the transition. Okay, so there is a concentration of capital in that respect. There's plenty of unemployment now. The economy is really deep in the depression. So everything looks bad, but unemployment reduces V. You understand? By reducing V, it increases beta. Okay? And therefore it allows the capitalist system to start all over again in terms of an expanded level of accumulation on a more advanced technological basis, because meanwhile the technique of production gamma has changed on a more advanced technology. But and then we come to the final point, yes, that can go on forever. But Marx argues that it cannot go on forever because there is a limit to which you can expand better. As I said, cannot go more than 100% of the, cannot reach 100% of the hours that workers devote to the process of accumulation. They cannot be totally expropriated, otherwise they will survive. Whereas there is no limit to the increasing number. This can increase indefinitely. There is no specific limit to the increasing number. And from cycle to cycle, the whole onus, the whole weight of changing the structure of the economy, the technique of production, falls on the C over B relation. That is, falls on gamma. And this means that eventually the economy, capital accumulation in the capitalist mode of production gets trapped into its own mechanism of profit accumulation, and this manifests itself, this trap manifests itself in the falling rate of profit. That's the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in Marx. So the long-term tendency of the capitalist economy is the fall in the rate of profit. So the rate of profit falls, okay, as a result of the very capital accumulation. And there is no solution to that. There is no solution. Here you have solutions by juggling, VES, and all that sort of stuff. But here you have no solution. Gamma increases, the rate of, this is called organic composition of capital. Gamma increases, and this, in the end, it will squash profits totally out of the system. And the system, while remaining capitalistic in its mode of production, becomes inconsistent with the profit creation, because profits are choking it, okay, through the rate of capital, increasing the technique of production of capital intensity. And that is the final, ultimate crisis in the economic system by Marx. It's the ultimate crisis. This is the most controversial part of Marx, the most controversial part, because it is definitely untrue. It's untrue. And Marx was aware that it was untrue. Marx was completely aware that it was problematical, because Marx devotes, this is all in volume 3 of Capital. And in volume 3 of Capital, Marx devotes most of the chapters on the falling rate of profit. He devotes them to discuss the reasons why the rate of profit won't fall. Yeah? Not why it will fall, but why it will not fall. So he states the law, as he calls it, of the falling rate of profit, but then he goes chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter to discuss why it will not fall. And then he says, well, but in the end he hangs on to it. He hangs on to the falling rate of profit. But what? This is because he's so faithful to Ricardo. Because Ricardo also had a fall in the rate of profit through rent, squeezing profits out. The rent squeezes profit out. In Marx, everything is within capitalism, within the capitalist system of production, and therefore it is not rent that squeezes profits out. In the short term, it's wages and profit moving inversely, but in the longer term, the structural aspect is that profit squeeze profit out through capital accumulation. Capital accumulation squeezes the profits out of the system. That's what Marx, but Marx himself was extremely doubtful, extremely doubtful about it. I mean, there is, perhaps I put it there. There's a very nice piece in Monthly Review, New York, by a guy in Germany who is updating there's a whole bunch of people, because when the Soviet system collapsed, then Humboldt University in Berlin was in charge with Moscow, was in charge of, because the new manuscripts were being found, etc., of developing. And when in 1990 everything, thanks to Gorbachev, everything collapsed, okay, then the Humboldt University had all these big manuscripts, etc., and they were about to junk it. They were about to jump in. And then at the last minute, they said, okay, perhaps we should not take such a revenge, up to this point, to just send them to some sort of basement which they will rot in damp and all that sort of stuff. And then they were rescued by a bunch of people in Rotterdam University. They were taken up by these people in Rotterdam, but these people in Rotterdam, they actually ran out of money, and finally the West German government, today the German government, plus in a Stiftung, it's called a foundation named after Rosa Luxemburg. They got money and they basically rescued that sort of the manuscript. And now there is a whole group of people working in Germany, in the Freie University in Berlin, to put together and to continue the publication of the complete works of Marx, and as they keep finding more manuscripts. And there was one of them, of the people who worked on this project, wrote in Monthly Review an article explaining the falling rate of profit in Marx very well, how it was tentative, not conclusive, not really that Marx himself had some big problems with it. But this has affected the mind of many Marxists. Many Marxists affected the mind. Two things affect the mind of Marxists, two things. Because Marx and Marxist are not the same thing, okay? Marx even said, je ne suis pas Marxiste. I don't know whether you know about that. Marx said, the Marxists went to him and they said, they wanted support, etc. And he said, no, je ne suis pas Marxiste. I am not Marxist. That's what Marx says. And he was right, completely right. You should not be. So, the two things affected Marxists. One thing is the notion of exploitation, surplus value. Okay? Workers are exploited, etc., etc. And as my former Italian professor, this is where I studied, Aloisio Slavini used to say, they just ran away with wishing to kiss, to give a kiss on the mouth of the working class. Okay? So, bacio in bocca alla classe operaia. That was and they don't hear anything else. Just bacio in bocca alla classe operaia, and that's it. Kiss on the mouth of the working class. That's it. And then you don't see anything else. Everything is completely obfuscated by this terrible desire of kissing the working class. And the other thing, which I never had. The other thing is the falling rate of profit. The falling rate of profit. You go into, just Google, and there is a guy called Andrew Clymer. It's a university which is not, but he made a big fuss. It's a Pace University in New York. Andrew Clymer. He has written a whole book about the falling rate of profit is the thing, is the real thing in Marx. That everything has to be explained by the falling rate of profit. This book in Marxist circles had made a big noise. It's nonsense. Another guy is Carcedi, Guglielmo Carcedi. Actually, he's the more reasonable of them, also because he's Italian. No, I'm serious. I'm not saying, the reason why I say that because he's Italian is more reasonable, because in Italy, perhaps not in the last 15 to 20 years, but in Italy, education was among the very best in the world, in the sense that it was philosophical, historical, literary. It was not just, either techniques or hyper-specialized, especially if you come from the classical high school in Italy or scientific high school, especially the classical. You have the best education still exists, in my view, in the world, I think. This is my view. And I can see it also of people that apply for PhDs and stuff in why am I getting all this in other university. So that one is Guglielmo Cartelli, who is more subtle, sophisticated. He has things in English. He teaches actually at York University. Guglielmo Cartelli. He teaches at York University in England, not the Canadian one. And he has a paper about the crisis. I tell you what, the crisis is a falling rate of profit, the present crisis. But the profits went through the roof over, for more than 10, 20 years. They just went through the roof. And he tells the story that the profit, the crisis is due to the falling rate of profit. Of course, he has to fudge. Therefore, he has to develop a particular statistical approach in order to show that the crisis is due to the falling rate of profit. Because he says, at face value, on the face of it, you don't see the falling rate. Of course you don't see, there isn't any falling in the rate of profit, That's why you don't see. Therefore, this is why you have to fudge in the end, And that's the strength of Marx, really, what is the development of a theory of the business cycle, that it has influenced all the other business cycle. The person who followed up to Marx was the great, he became especially famous, he died in 1950, he was very famous because he's a guy who developed a theory of entrepreneurship, developed a theory of development, etc., Joseph, because this was Austrian, but then moved to the United States, Joseph Schumpeter, very famous, everybody who deals with the history of technologies, etc., comes across Schumpeter. And Schumpeter takes up the Marxian story of the business side, actually, by introducing entrepreneurship and other elements. So it's a very, very important part of the construction of dynamic systems in economic thinking, Marx. Okay? So that's the important. For the rest, Marx has all the limitations of Ricardo. All the limitations of Ricardo. In other words, Marx thinks that the labor theory of value is consistent. I'm going to finish here. The labor finished part. He thinks that the labor theory of value is consistent. Exactly like Ricardo. Unlike Ricardo, however, he is aware of the problem Ricardo encountered, and he tries to solve it. Okay? He tries to solve it. He tries to show that commodities, he tries to argue that commodities do not really change at values. He says that. So you ask me, why is that in the first volume everything is written as where his basic theory is located? Why is that in the first volume he says that commodities exchange at values, while he completely recognizes that commodities do not exchange at labor values? Because, he says, this was really cunning. Yeah, he says, what you see is not what it actually happens. What we see is that commodities do not exchange at values, because the proportion of direct to indirect labor in every branch is different, and therefore they cannot exchange at values, because you have different means, proportions in the means of production. So what you see is, this is what you see. But, he says, this is a product, it's not a theoretical problem. It's the product of the capitalist relations of production. So this fact that commodities don't exchange at values on the surface, Remember, in Marx there's always dialectics. It's the Hegelian dialectics between what appears and what it doesn't and so on. So, on the surface, you don't see commodities exchanging at values. They exchange in proportion to the ratio between capital, between machinery and labor. So it's called prices of production. This is called prices of production. It is the price of production of the commodity in which machinery is greater in relation to labor than in a commodity where it is lower. The price of production will be determined by a different set of values than that in the sector where there is less machinery relatively to labor. Okay, you follow me on that? So these are called prices of production. Clearly, if you have a commodity where capital, physical capital, machinery is more important relatively, say, to this one than labor in proportion, is more important, then you should expect physical capital to show up, capital charges to show up in the final prices more than in this, okay? And therefore you cannot say that leaving labor, variable capital, is the determinant of final value. You cannot say that anymore. You have to include all the components of the cost of production. These are the prices of production. Marx says this is all true, but, he says, this is because the capitalist system subverts its own law of value. How does it subvert it? It is as if, let's say, the value of all production, okay, was poured, was thrown, put into a huge bank or like a sort of huge pool. You pool all those values together, okay, you put them into a huge pool, and you start distributing this value not according to the amount of labor which is put into production, but according to the amount of capital which is put into production. So the distortion from prices of production to labor values, that is the result of the capitalist system, the relations of ownership and production that exist under the capitalist system. But the process cannot happen. The process cannot happen unless labor produces all the value. Is that it is redistributed not according to labor inputs, but according to the proportion of capital. Okay, that's what he says. And so he proceeded trying to solve this problem, but he didn't succeed. He did not succeed. Essentially, the problem, in my view, was solved by a guy very famous in economics, Luigi Pasinetti of the University of Catholic University of Milan, in which he showed that you have a consistency between labor values and prices of production, but you cannot determine which comes first. And this is a problem for Marx, because for Marx, labor values must come first, because labor values determine also the prices of production. Okay, this is an unsolved issue in Marx, which comes straight from Ricardo. Okay, I'm just mentioning it for you because this is something that comes back and back again and again in the academic literature. It has absolutely no importance for understanding the surrounding world, but it's part. If people talk about Marxist economics, they have to be aware of this. If they talk about Marxist stuff, they have to be aware of that. But I think that the most important thing of Marx is actually the mechanism of the business cycle with unemployment. He didn't call unemployment, he called it reserve army of labor. Okay, that's how he called it. Now it's final thing. The interesting aspect is we moved from Marx to 1957, I think 57 or 58. In 1957 and 58, there appeared an article in a journal which is still a very important journal. It's the Journal of the London School of Economics, which is called Economica. And it's one of the people in universities, they would sell their daughters, they would, whatever, kill their grandfather, whatever, in order to publish in Economica, because it's considered to be one of the top 10. The top 10 economic journals are American Economic Review, number 1, Econometrica, number 2, is top 10. Economica is one of them, Economic Journal in England, these are the 2 English papers. And Journal of Political Economy, Chicago, these are the, if you want to have a career, you publish it, okay? And then you publish, you get not only full professorship, but, Uberstaufer professor of something and other in some university, and that's what you get. But in 1957, a guy who walked all the way from New Zealand to England, really walked, all the way from New Zealand to England, and was an electrical engineer, was a mining engineer in Australia for a while. Then, as I said, he walked all the way from New Zealand to England, published a very, very important article. The guy is called Arthur Phillips, and he came up with the Phillips curve. Phillips curve he used day in and day out in economic analysis, day in and day out today, okay? The Phillips, what he did, he had no idea, I don't think he ever even read Marx ever. And he was an electrical engineer. After the war, he ended up in England walking through Soviet Union, China, Soviet Union, walk to England. And then got himself into a PhD at the London School of Economics, and then started doing something. He had an engineering mentality, and therefore he developed engineering system, which is applied to economics. And quite smart guy. And he produced in 1957 an article on the relationship between variation in wages and unemployment, changes in wages and unemployment. That's the Phillips curve. That is to say, that's a statistical work, just statistical work from the mid of the 19th century in Britain, 1864, till 1951, 52. We took all the data that we could come across. England had pretty good data from way back because they always collected very good data on these things. And he developed what basically Marx did. But what he found out is that in his statistical analysis, is that wages rise when employment is low, right? So employment low, employment is high, sorry. Let's put it, wages rise when unemployment is low, put it better, and wages tend to fall when unemployment is high, okay? That's Marx. Marx came up with that. The Reserve Army of Labor by Marx is exactly that. When there is unemployment, wages fall. Capital accumulation starts all over again. When capital accumulation is very successful, so it builds, so they need labor, they run out of labor. Capital accumulation tends to be more dynamic than the supply of labor because it is based on new technologies and stuff like that. So by the end of the day, they will run out of labor as they approach full employment. Wages rise again, and as they rise again, they squash profits and they do all those sort of things. But that's Phillips came up exactly with that result, statistic. But he did not. I don't think he has ever read Marx. I think that but that's what the style he came up with exactly the same. I'm the only person to point it out. No one. Look, it's there. Just read Phillips. Read Phillips and read Marx, and you see that Marx has anticipated, has foreseen the Arthur Philip results without the two being at all ideologically, epistemologically related. He had no idea of Marx. Perhaps he knew that it existed, of course, but he did not absorb. He was not thinking in Marxian economic terms. I don't think he was ever. So this is a very important element that, legacy or significance of Marx today. The other element which I will elaborate upon it later on is, in the course, is the fact that Marx came within the domain. I won't say just whiskers from, I just within the domain, within the area of what today is known as the Keynesian theory of effective demand. Marx came very close to it, quite close to it, within the orbit, but didn't stay in the orbit. And the reason is Ricardo, the bad influence of Ricardo on Marx. This is Ricardo. Because if you take Keynes' criticism of Ricardo, you can apply a lot of the criticism toward Ricardo by Keynes onto Marx. Okay? A lot of it. It's not that Keynes considered savings, that's the important point. In Keynes, savings are, if you save, does not mean that you invest in Keynes. So if you save and you don't invest, you reduce national income. You reduce employment, income and employment. So the accumulation of savings in Keynes is a bad thing, not a good thing. Okay? The accumulation of savings in the classics, it's a good thing, including Marx. Right? Smith, every frugal man, unquote, a public benefactor. So, you are Protestant in Scotland, dark there, church. In Glasgow, don't eat, especially don't eat good stuff. And you save. For Smith, that's good. Saving is accumulation of stocks. That's the core model. Okay, what you don't consume, you save to plant back. Okay? Marx, too, not in the moral sense of Adam Smith, but he actually says, I find it, he says that savings is the most important, savings and accumulation, the most important activity of the capitalist. So whatever drives accumulation is driven by savings, and Marx has exactly the same. So you ask me, so why do you say that he came within the framework, the orbit of the theory of effective demand that later on was developed by Keynes and another guy coming from Marx, actually, and especially a woman that came very close to the Keynesian theory, Rosa Luxemburg. So why is that you say that? Well, I say that because Marx read everything. There's one thing that Marx read, you can rest assured of, is that Marx read everything. You know? I mean, he let his family starve because he was busy in the British Library reading. You know? That's no. Basically, one of his daughters almost sort of died of essentially, malnutrition. I mean, they were subject to malnutrition. He didn't have money, was asking Engels to send money to them. But, so he was spending his time in the British Library, reading, was reading everything. In every possible language and everything, he was reading it. And he read the people who were actually asking questions about this, whether accumulation could go on forever, but not for Ricardian reasons of rent choking up profits or falling rate of profit in the sense of mass and garment composition. There was a guy who was a kind of, nobody knew who he was, because he was like changing his names all the time. They say, an aristocrat clearly, the beginning of the 18th century must have been an aristocrat who could, otherwise very few people could be intellectual at that time. Yeah? So it must have been Simon de Sismondi. He was a bit French, a bit Swiss, he was around the Alps. He was walking about in the Alps. Okay? Geneva, Italy, the time Milan, and so forth, and essentially Geneva, a bit Paris. Simon de Sismondi, he raised an issue right away. If people, if everything goes to accumulation, who is going to consume? Accumulation cannot sustain. Who is going to buy things? If everything is saving, who is going to buy? He raised that issue. Another one was Malthus. Malthus, again, he argued, as I mentioned before, that unproductive consumption was necessary in order to absorb the surplus. So Marx knew all this sort of stuff, okay? And so, in volume 2 of Capital, he comes very near to the issue of the Keynesian issue of demand. Within sight, but he doesn't go into it. He doesn't transform it into a theory. It becomes an observation. You see, an oddity, an observation. The theoretical framework remains that of the first volume, which is essentially the Ricardian influence, where the problem of effective demand does not arise. Okay, does not arise. Accumulation drives everything. So we'll find Marx, because later on, when we discuss Keynes, or the Keynesian framework, because I'm going to bring out precisely those aspects of Marx which lead us to the theory of effective demand. The effective demand means that accumulation is demand constrained. The dynamics of the economy is constrained by demand. And therefore, you cannot posit the fact that savings are always invested. Savings, if they are don't find an outlet in investment, savings depress the economy. And that's the big thing in Keynes. That is the epistemological break in Keynes. That is why Keynes argues that all those before him were classical. He calls them classical. I will not call them classical. I call them classical, Smith, Ricardo, Marx. Neoclassical, the market-based theories of equilibrium. Okay? But Keynes called all those before him, including Ricardo, and Marx he didn't talk much about, because it wasn't that polite in society to say that, to talk about Marx. But whenever he talked about Marx, he actually talked positively, very little notes here and there. And because he had people who knew about Marx and would feed him. That's one was Piero Sraffa, and the other was Maurice Dobb. I mean, these were the people who would feed him on Marx. But for Keynes, the epistemological break is precisely the fact that savings are not transformed into investment automatically. There is no automatic mechanism whereby savings transform themselves into investment. There is no automatic mechanism in the sense of Ricardo Cohen model or Marx system of accumulation, and there is no automatic mechanism in the neoclassical sense, which we haven't studied yet and will see later. And that's why he calls everybody else before him classical. So they are all classical. We all assume that savings drive investment, are automatically invested. That's not true. That's not true. And for him, that's the real epistemological break, the real separation, the real break in the system of thinking. And it has very significant implications, Okay? And I'll give you a very simple example. Falling wages in Marx, in neoclassical economics as well, for different reasons, falling wages raises the rate of profit, okay? But in Keynes it doesn't, because in falling wages it reduces the level of effective demand, and therefore it creates unemployment, okay? That's very simple. So it does not, the falling wages does not stimulate employment, because there was the policy issue at hand as it is today, and the falling wages does not actually create additional conditions for recession. And here and there, people agree. For instance, not long ago, only a few weeks ago or a month ago was what, and that's the reason why Larry Summers did not become head of the governor of the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, because Larry Summers said, what we need here really is a wage rise, but no one is, because in the United States, like here in Europe as well, wages are falling. Real wages are falling, there's no doubt about that. And he said, look, if there is no increase in wages, we are not going to get out of this morass, of this situation. He said, Larry Summers. It's not Marxist Larry Summers, okay? He's a big guy from Harvard, from whatever, IMF and World Bank he was before, and so on. So, real wages should rise, but no one is willing to increase wages, because in order to increase wages, you have to have expectations about profits, etc. There are no big expectations about increases in output and so on. So no one is willing, and the labor market is actually quite slack, and therefore it's easy to get a good bargain on the side of the employer, so therefore wages are not rising, But this is what we need. Well, since we cannot get that, let's have a new bubble. That's what he said, a new financial bubble. Because that's the only way in which you can get people, to start buying in a big way that will stimulate investment, etc. In the United States, most of GDP is consumption. It's about more than 70% of GDP is consumption. 90% of the population, 92% of the population is wage earners. They draw a salary from somewhere. Okay, so it's not that they're not self-employed and so on. They are wage earners. So if wages, on average, they are not rising, well, who is going to buy the stuff? That's what Larry Summers said. But the situation is such that wages are not rising. They cannot rise because they slack. There is the Martian phenomenon, reserve army of labor. They is slack in the labor market. Okay, there is a Martian phenomenon on the supply side, slack in the labor market. There is no Martian phenomenon on the output side, though, because if they slack in the labor market, wages are not rising, then demand is not expanding as it should in order to absorb enough unemployment, and to reduce unemployment in a significant way, including also those that they give up and therefore they don't show up in the statistics of unemployment. So, the argument that the only way in which you can get these things going in a significant, robust manner is to have a new financial bubble, so that people get into debt. Not so you buy, not because you have income, because you are getting more debt, right? You're getting into debt. That's what we have to have. That's what he said. Well, these are Marxian elements there. They are very strong Marxian and Keynesian. Keynesian on the output side, Marxian on the supply side. And okay, that's it. Finished. End of story. Do you have any question? Question? No question? You call it today? Yeah, so I'll see you tomorrow. Unless you have a question. What question? I'll have to answer. Okay, I also do some additional readings with Moodle. That will be